Hello, everyone. Welcome to a live episode of Red Medicine, streaming from the World Transformed in Liverpool. For those that don't know, Red Medicine is a podcast about radical politics, medical anthropology, and the sociology of science. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Johnbosco Nwogbo from We Own It, and we're going to talk a little bit about the future of the National Health Service. So, Johnbosco is lead campaigner at We Own It, which is a campaign group organising against privatisation and arguing for 21st century public ownership of the NHS. So, Johnbosco, thanks so much for taking a chance to speak with me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you. How's it going?
Thank you so much. I am a tiny bit tired because obviously I just finished a panel earlier, and I don't know if it's that I don't know how to navigate Liverpool or that Liverpool has really terrible public transportation. But it took me quite a long time to get back to my place to be able to join this. But I'm here finally, and I'm really excited to get on with the discussion.
Good. And we'll try and sidestep any scouse beef about public transit.
Well,
So,
actually, before we sidestep it, I should mention that obviously you know that uh, uh, the mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, recently brought their buses under public control, and you know the second mayor that is going to do that is Steve Rotherham, the mayor of the Liverpool City region, right? So they really do need to get public transport right here, and the mayor knows that and seems to be getting on with it.
yeah, well, that's actually a very good organic segue into the first thing I was going to ask you about, actually. So we're going to talk about the NHS, and we're going to talk about what it means to be publicly owned and privatization and labor and a few different things. But I thought to start us off, I would ask you what actually makes a healthcare system publicly owned? Like, what does that term sort of really mean in practice? What are the defining characteristics and structures that make a healthcare system considered publicly owned? So if you could start us off with that, that'd be
Yeah.
great.
That's a really, really like complicated question to answer. Obviously, there you can assess a healthcare system on a number of different levels, right? You can look at it in terms of the structures within that system. So, for example, if you take NHS, let's say the NHS in England, there is the Department for Health and Social Care at the top. Then you have NHS England that's responsible for the NHS within England. Within NHS England, you have 42 things that are called integrated care systems. So essentially, regional regional and health bodies that make commissioning decisions about the NHS in each area. So that's one way to think about the structure of a health service, right? You could also think about it in terms of um, how many different kinds of pots does funding come out from, right? So if you took the French model, for example, where some of the funding comes out of people's pockets, other of the funding comes from the public purse. Some of the funding, as I understand it, comes from the employer. In the US, they obviously most of the funding comes from people. Here in the UK, most of the funding comes out of general taxation, right? So there are a whole host of ways that you could evaluate a healthcare system and judge one or the other as perhaps more amenable to what we would call public ownership or a healthcare system that doesn't have privatization in it. But I think that at the core of what makes a healthcare system publicly owned versus not publicly owned
Mm-hmm.
is two things, right? One of them is whose incentives are given priority within this system, or rather, whose benefits do the incentives operate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a healthcare system, let's say in the US, and people like to pretend as though we overuse the example of the US, but the US is a massive, massive kind of healthcare system and market, right? And they are also trying to stretch their hands beyond their borders. So it's really, really important that we understand what's
Yeah.
happening there. Um, there you have essentially healthcare working for the for-profit hospitals, for-profit insurance companies, where whether you get care is determined by, well, what's going to make the hospital the most money.
Hmm.
Whether you get care is determined by whether or not the insurance company can find a way to, or cannot find a way to deny you coverage on that particular issue, right? So the framework of incentives obviously appears to lend itself more to the interests of those who stand to make a lot of profit.
Mm.
Whereas in our own traditional NHS model, which and I like to call it traditional NHS model because we've moved away from that, and perhaps we could talk a little bit more about how that has happened. Um, it, the healthcare system works for people, right? The way that I like to characterize this is in the UK, for example, if all illness suddenly disappeared, would the NHS be happy or sad by that occurrence, right? Obviously, it would be happy, right? It means we're saving almost 200 billion pounds a year in money
Mm.
that would go into healthcare,
Mm.
right? We're able to have a healthy kind of quote unquote um, workforce and therefore economy.
Mm.
Right? So it works for the NHS that we are healthy.
Mm.
On the other hand, if we all suddenly became healthy, do you think that the private companies involved in healthcare would be happy? Right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because they're making profit out of our sickness.
yeah.
And in essence, their incentives are such that it should not be the case that we are well, right?
Mm.
Our continued ailment or sickness is to their benefit. And um, obviously, we cannot, in some ways, we cannot live without sickness. But
Mm.
this thought experiment allows you to find out essentially the interests underlying the system. And I think that for a service to be publicly owned, it ought to be one where the framework of incentives lend themselves to a system that puts the patient before profit, right? A
Yeah,
system where your health is their complete and total interest.
yeah.
Whereas in the other model, you have profit being part of the question.
So, as you sort of alluded to there, the NHS has moved away from a kind of public model, despite being sort of nominally called that, and maybe not totally having abandoned aspects of that. How would you describe the degree to which the NHS has deviated from a public model? I mean, I know the campaigning you're doing with We Own It around the Labour conference, which we can talk a little bit about. You're arguing for Labour to reinstate the NHS as a fully public service. So, to what degree do you think it's deviated? How far have we gone?
Um, I suppose I would say that we have not deviated too much, but
Hmm.
I would also say that we are on a track that can lend itself to rapid deviation, right?
Mm.
So if we wanted to talk about it in terms of raw numbers, the NHS has a budget of around 170 billion pounds a year, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and the Labour Party analysis from 2021 found that in the 10 years to 2021, about 100 billion, so about what 60-70% of 1 year's budget had gone to the private sector, right? So it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's still significantly small, right?
Mm.
um, there's another element of privatization, obviously, of when the NHS, when the government, the Department for Health and Social Care, makes an allocation of the NHS budget. Obviously, much of it goes to NHS England,
Mm.
and then some of that money then goes to the local or regional commissioning bodies, right? So they commission care. Most of the care they commission is commissioned from NHS trusts and foundation trusts, so the hospitals, the ambulances, and so on and so forth. And usually, when we think about privatization, obviously, we mostly think about the privatization that happens at the level of NHS England or at the level of the regional or local commissioning bodies.
Mhm.
But increasingly, we are seeing NHS trusts themselves who have received a contract from the NHS to perform A, B, and C service,
Mm.
then subcontracting a private company to perform a portion of that service that they themselves have been commissioned to deliver, right? So we've seen, for example, a BMA analysis showing that I think we've seen growth of around 599% in the last 10 years, right?
Mm.
So it's growing.
Mm.
It's still relatively small kind of portion of the NHS budget,
Mhm.
but the changes that were put in place by the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, and even more importantly, the 2021 Health and Care Act, I think have put the NHS on a really fast track to enter kind of meddling the interests of private companies with the interests of the NHS, right? The
Mm.
creation of these things called provider collaboratives, and I'm not trying to dump information on people here, but it's quite difficult to
Yeah.
talk through all of this without mentioning some of these names. The creation of these things called provider collaboratives that can include private companies. It will include NHS trusts and foundation trusts, but it could also include private companies. And these bodies will have the power to make decisions about who provides care in
Mm.
any given area.
Mm.
And private companies are going to be a part of it. There's no transparency about how this works.
Mm.
Essentially, allows the private sector to play not just a role of providing services, which they currently do, but also that of making decisions about
Mm.
who's going to provide services, right? So we
Mm.
are on a really dangerous path, and that's what we are saying.
Yeah.
And we will be campaigning, as you mentioned earlier, over the next 12 months, leading into the next general election, at Keir
Mm.
Starmer and the Labour Party kind of stand up for what is in effect the Labour Party's baby, right? The
Mm.
NHS was created by the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer does need to stand up for the NHS and reinstate it as the fully public service that Nia Bevan created it to be.
Mm. So, do you think it would be all right to kind of name some of the companies and some of the organizations driving this change? Because I feel like that's often something that's missing from conversations around the way the NHS is changing.
Mm.
Who are some of the organizations, companies, investors driving this change? Where are they based out of? Like, what's their kind of background? Like, who's actually kind of driving this, other than just politicians, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's quite useful. I suppose there are two ways to answer that. Number one is that it's politicians are by far the most important. And when I say politicians, I do mean the Secretary of State and the Shadow Secretary of State for Health.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really important. I do also, of course, mean MPs and local councillors. They have quite a lot of kind of voice.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'm also referring to people that there's a group of people that are not typically thought of as politicians, which are like NHS decision makers,
Mm.
because they're not frontline staff in the traditional sense. They don't work in hospitals; they work in offices, and their job is to make decisions for the NHS and about the NHS. And obviously, the only respect in which they're not politicians is that they are not elected, but they are appointed by people who are elected, right?
Mm.
The chairs or the chairs of all of the integrated care boards are appointed by NHS England and approved by the Secretary of State for Health, right?
Mm.
So those are an important lever in moving the NHS in the direction that it's going in. But I think the private companies are also really, really important. I spoke on the panel on the TWT panel earlier about some of the campaigns that we've run and won to push back against privatization. And the company I spoke specifically about was Centene, an American multinational corporation that last year took over, not last year, in 2021, in February, took over 37 NHS GP surgeries in London, in addition to about 21 that they already owned in the rest of England, making them the largest provider of primary care of GP surgeries in England, right? That's a private company. So that's a company that I think is driving a lot of this change. Centene was also involved, and um, the extent and nature of their involvement is not always very transparent, but they were
Mm.
also involved in designing the integrated care system model before it was actually implemented. It was trialed in Nottingham, where they were quite involved in kind of working through that system there, right?
Mm.
So Centene is a really important player. Virgin Care used to be a really important player. Of course, we are very familiar with Virgin Care with Richard Branson. I believe Richard Branson sold his stake in Virgin Care last
Mm.
year, and there is the new company. I think it's called HCRG, if I'm not mistaken, and they're no less dangerous than Virgin Care. They're just, I suppose, they decided to throw us off the scent with a long, confusing, boring name. Virgin Care is actually quite a snazzy name.
Mm.
If Richard Branson knows anything, he knows branding. Um, right. So they're also an important player. They're an important player in healthcare, but I think that they're probably more an important player in care, in social care, right? Which is another important element of this whole equation. Um, yeah, there are other companies. Today, for example, we had on, so the action that we took today had the last five conservative prime ministers, or people playing the last five conservative prime ministers, and each of them was carrying a knife, which with kind of pepper cut out prop knife, a large thing that they were essentially playing at using to stab the NHS. And each of those prime ministers had the logo of a private healthcare company
Mm.
on their knives, and we didn't choose them at random. We chose private healthcare companies, or private companies, really, not just healthcare companies, that had a big role during that person's time in government. So for Boris Johnson, for example, we had Serco, the company that ran the ill-fated 33 billion pounds worth of track and trace, which Parliament said was utterly useless to the whole fighting pandemic endeavor.
Yeah.
And Serco, of course, doesn't just do things like that. They run a lot of security, cleaning, porter services at hospitals, NHS trusts hospitals,
Mm.
right? So they are an important player as well. Um, and they're an important player additionally because they have a lot of traditional roots within the Tory party. The CEO of Circa, I forget his name right now, is the Winston Churchill's grandson, I believe.
Right.
Right. So it's these are the companies that I think are driving the agenda of privatization within the NHS. We had Ayanda Capital for Liz Trust, who um, was only prime minister for 44 days, but she had a link with Ayanda Capital through somebody who worked for her, an advisor of hers. Ayanda Capital ended up getting, yes, Nicholas Soames, ended up getting a contract to provide PPE worth £250 million during the pandemic, much of which then had to be kind of thrown away because they could not be used by NHS staff safely.
Mm.
So these are the companies that are doing this. They're terrible at their jobs. Last year, an Oxford study showed that 557 deaths were linked to NHS privatization in the last 6 years. And yeah, it would be explicable if they were okay at their jobs. Not
Yeah.
that it would excuse it, but
Mm.
be somewhat explicable. But they're terrible at their jobs. If you want to do a fun exercise, you go to NHS England's website, just type in any random private company that provides services for the NHS, right?
Mm.
And read the reviews.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
They're terrible at it, and I think it strikes at the core of why this is happening. Put
Yeah.
profit before people, you're going to do a terrible job. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we're at TWT, which kind of runs alongside the Labour conference. You've been at the conference as well. We know Keir Starmer loves business. He's not interested in a sort of members-based party. He's interested in a party backed by, private interests. What are your expectations of a Keir Starmer government, assuming he wins the next election? What are you kind of expecting, both in terms of how much he might sort of give, but also what we can sort of force out of him, in what ways we can kind of pressure him to give more than he might like?
I think that obviously, I think that the relationships between the Labour Party and especially the private healthcare companies, obviously they have relationships that are worrying across the range of our public services. But since we're talking about the NHS now, we could kind of hone that down to private healthcare companies. They're extremely worrying. But I think that there's a way that I like to think about it that I would like to suggest that people think about it as well, right? So why do politicians take money from private healthcare, from private interests? They think that they need money to run elections, and if you have money, I don't know about the UK, but I know that in the US, 9 out of 10 times, the candidate that has the most money or that spends the most money wins the election. And it's a very simple kind of mechanical thing of the more money you have, the more people you can reach with all sorts of kind of electioneering tools, right? Um, Adverts, letter, letters through people's doors, and so on and so forth. Right. So that's the way they think about it. Think about it in terms of, just to give them the benefit of the doubt, they're thinking about it in terms of, we need to win elections. So we need money. And in order to get this money, we need to play politics in a particular way to make ourselves palatable to the sources of this money, where we can find enough of the money, enough money to win. Let's put it that way, right?
Yeah.
Now, if the underlying goal is to win elections, which is driving them in this direction, it means that if we're able to sufficiently demonstrate to them that we can marshal the public in such a way that they could actually put their chances of winning this election at risk if they don't do A, B, or C things. So in this case, reinstating the NHS as a fully public service, regardless of who they've taken money from. If we're successful at demonstrating to them that they can put their chances of winning this election at risk, then we stand a very good chance of getting them to make change, right? I don't think of politicians as endemically corrupt, and I don't think of politicians as endemically stuck in one interest. They really just care about winning elections ultimately, and whatever it is that they think will help them win, they try and do it. And we can present to them an opportunity to win an election by doing what's popular, which we can do the work of making a salient top issue at that election. Then I think we stand a really good chance of getting them to do what we want, right? Getting them to make us the commitments that we're asking them to make. And and to that end, I think it's really, really important that we don't think so much about who's giving the money. Are they likely to change their minds? We should focus on what we can do to get them to change their minds, because they're politicians, they're going to change their minds. Yeah, there are very few politicians who, like, I think it was Tony Blair who said that if I could have won running as a socialist, I would if I could have won running socialist, I would have preferred to lose or something like that. Um, right. So there are not many politicians that way, and I don't even think that he was being totally truthful, um, saying that. So my view is that our job is to bring the pressure. The politician's job is to bend to the pressure.
Okay. So this might be my final question. What does that application of pressure look like specifically it'd be great if we could link it to the strike wave that we've seen across the healthcare sector. I mean, that's been one of the highlights of the last year, in my mind, in terms of political organising. There's been some really great strike action and organising going on. What does that pressure look like, and how does it relate to how we organise in our workplace, or maybe outside the workplace, to support others in their workplace?
Yeah, I think that's a really really good question. So obviously, I think organizing in the workplace, especially supporting um, the striking workers, right? So NHS nurses and doctors, both consultants and junior doctors. Um, I think is in some ways, in addition to the fight against NHS privatization, the defining fight of the next number of years, right? Because if the nurses and doctors lose their fight, there's a very good chance that we lose the NHS,
Yeah.
because essentially we're hemorrhaging staff to other countries who are offering better terms and conditions and better pay.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment the NHS is so ruined by the shortage of staff, the fact that they're bringing in people who are not trained as doctors to do the job of doctors, that's going to lead to more kind of bad stories coming out of the NHS.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, we are going in the direction of what that famous Noam Chomsky statement of first they run it down and then they offer privatization as a solution to it, right?
Yeah.
That's the direction that we're going to. So we have every interest in rooting for these nurses and doctors.
Mm-hmm.
If they're able to win better pay and better conditions, it's going
Mm-hmm.
to bring back a lot of those who have left the service as a result of pressure and as a result of low pay. And the more of them come back, the less pressure it is on those within the system,
Mm-hmm.
which means they're more likely to stay. The effect of what the government is doing is pretty much the exact, but in the opposite direction. The more people leave, the more pressure on those who remain. Therefore, the more likely those ones who remain are to leave, and
Mm-hmm.
so on and so forth, right? So, really, really important to support the strikes. So important. Nothing could be more important. Secondly, I think is that we are continuing to make sure that the idea of private healthcare is not normalized,
Mm-hmm.
right? There is more and more people in the public realm speaking as though um, the choice of the private sector is a neutral choice,
Yeah.
right? All that we should care about is who's going to do the job. As I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, they're not always very good at doing the job to begin with, but the moment they reach a certain saturation level within the system, we're going to see the drive for profit creating the same effects that we see in the US, right? We see, and these are things that you people can look into themselves. We see 500,000 households every single year in the US going bankrupt, right? We see 40,000 people a year dying from lack of access to basic healthcare. Um, Millions and millions of Americans not covered at all, right? So really, really important, I think, that we're fighting on both of these fronts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think putting pressure on the Labour Party is really important. But what's also very, very important is making sure that people across their communities with the specific kind of healthcare services that they use know the implications for what's going to happen and that they are standing up for those services. In our campaigning around Centene, what I have found is that it's quite difficult to get people interested in some notion of the NHS and privatization and all of that. It's really important people get interested in opposing privatization. Obviously, that's what we do. But people get even more involved on a local community level when you say to them, your GP surgery with your doctors, right? This is going to happen, this is happening. People kind of prick up, right? And they get involved. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. I think there's loads more I could ask you about, and we've probably just scratched the surface of this discussion. But are there any kind of final points you want to make, or maybe let people know sort of where they can find the work you're doing, or sort of organizations you're working with and things like that, like where people can go to find all that?
Yes. So essentially, one thing that I would really like everyone to do today. So we took action today, of course, outside Labour conference. We're still working to try and get that into as much of the press as possible. Fingers crossed on that front. But the other kind of element of that plan is asking people to email Keir Starmer and West Streeting to make sure that they could not possibly have missed our demands out there today. And it's not possible that West Streeting would have missed it, because he came past our action and I gave him our leaflets and he was quite polite and took it from me, and I told him what it's about, right? So it's not possible that he would have missed it, but I think it gives it a lot more heft, and it piles on the pressure when we took action outside. They know we took action outside, and then they begin to get thousands of emails from people, right? And as of right now, I've actually was looking at this before. Thousands of people have actually already sent them emails, and really, really important that people go to weonit.org.uk, and on the web page you'll find the Act Now button. Click on it and take the first action you find there. Send the letters to Keir Starmer and West Streeting, and demand that they reinstate the NHS as a fully public service. And of course, we will be continuing to double down this demand, find interesting and creative ways to get this message into the press and put pressure on them that way, as well as finding opportunities in the community as well to do it.
Great. So one quick thing, Mia, we can give a shout out to South Tyneside Hospital staff, and I'm sorry to hear about your dad. Hope he feels better soon. And Johnbosco, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me. It's been a real pleasure, and hope to have the chance to speak to you again soon.
Thank you very, very much, Sam, and it was my pleasure to speak to you this afternoon.
Great. Thanks again.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.